Welcome to the Parnassah Podcast, where we deep dive into the financial challenges and opportunities Frum families face today. I'm your host, Eli Fried. Join me as we tackle the Parnassah questions on everyone's minds. How can we, as Frum Yidden living in the United States, make ends meet, build wealth, and live a Torah life with simcha and menuchas nefesh? Whether you're struggling to cover yeshiva tuition, wondering why your hefty income isn't stretching far enough, or looking for practical, savvy ways to help you and others with Parnassah, you've come to the right place. Together, we'll explore money and wealth through the lens of Torah, offering proactive, positive, and practical advice to navigate the unique financial landscape of Frum life. So let's roll. Hello, and welcome back to the Parnassah Podcast. In the first couple episodes, we spoke about the cost of living issues that the Frum community faces. And in this episode, you want to focus on the other side of the equation, the income side of the equation. Baruch Hashem, we got some great feedback on the first couple episodes. I decided to upgrade my mic stand, and now I'm feeling very, very professional. Some of the feedback we got mentioned that they enjoyed it, but perhaps it was a bit dry. We should get more to the juicy stuff, the exciting stuff, interviewing guests. So, I was thinking about it, and I realized that I am really aiming for a bit less entertainment and a bit more education. I do hope the education is interesting and occasionally entertaining. But overall, the Parnassah Podcast hopefully will be primarily about helping people learn things that they would not have known, or see perspective they may not have recognized. And, I view these episodes as foundational. And if you think about a foundation, if you hire an architect and then you hire a contractor to start building you a beautiful home, it could be pretty demoralizing when you're focusing on dirt and you're focusing on digging, you're focusing on a hole in the ground. But ultimately, a good foundation is what enables you to build something substantial and useful and beautiful and enjoyable. So it's my hope that you will find these foundational episodes useful to building your ability to understand with greater depth the challenges that Parnassah brings to many, many Frum families and the community as a whole, and some of the potential solutions, which will be our next segment, that we think are possible for people to utilize individually and for the community to bring to bear. And then down the line, we can go into greater detail and start bringing on professionals and experts and even interviewing people dealing with the challenges, which makes for great listening, exciting listening. But now we're still at the foundational side. So on the income side, once people finally recognize the significant cost that most Frum families end up bearing based on their family size, the cost of kosher, their geography, the social spending that becomes the norm, simchas, tuition, housing, etc. So then the obvious next question is, so how does everyone do it? Is everyone earning massive amounts of income except me? Everyone else is somehow able to pay for all the luxuries that we see that have become so common around us. The restaurants are full, the clothing boutiques are full, the jewelry stores are full, luxury cars are driving around, massive houses, vacations, basic programs. Obviously, that's not just one or two people. Many, many people are indulging in things that are not bare bones. And there's a common question and puzzlement even, like, how is this possible? Okay, you demonstrated that the cost of living for a typical Frum family is very, very high. So how does everyone do it? Take it one step further. There's data showing that many families are making less than $100,000. How is this shaykh? You just run a few basic numbers on tuition, housing, clothing, health insurance, and clearly for a full-size Frum family with 5, 7, 9 kids, it is not possible to pay all those bills without large incomes. So this is demoralizing and stressful to many people. And the general lack of clarity also drives social spending and thoughtless spending, because a lot of people say, look, I don't really understand how this works. I don't get the Frum economy. I don't understand how Parnassah works, but everyone figures it out. Just like and I'll similarly just figure it out. So I'll just do what everyone else is doing. If everyone is buying clothing from this in the store, buying this amount of outfits, everyone is moving into this neighborhood, buying this kind of home, driving this kind of car. There's a lot of just go with the flow in how we live our lives, which is perfectly normal, but very often that could end up leading people to lifestyles that get locked into levels that they just can't sustain in the long run. So, how do we clarify the realities over here? How do we help figure out what are some of the income sources that I call head in the sand income sources? These are incomes or ways that people are filling in the gaps in between what they're earning and what their costs are. And how does that make a huge impact on who's making it and how they're making it? We also hope to demonstrate the tremendous magnitude of outlier incomes that even a tiny percentage of the community earning huge sums of money can really influence entire sectors of the Frum economy and make massive waves, even though it's only a small number of people. But these outliers are having a huge impact. So the foundational statement of this podcast episode is spending is public, but income is private. It's easy to look around. You see people spending money. You see the houses, you see the cars, you see the clothing, you see the vacations, you see where they shop, you see how they talk, and you get a sense that obviously they're spending a lot of money. How they come up with the income to pay for that spending is private. People don't really know. They can try to guess. Oh, he's in this field. Oh, I heard that he's related to this and this person who gave him that and that advantage. But that is something that's generally private, and we hope to unmask some of that privacy here, obviously not using any names, but just to bring some clarity to the sources of income fillers that are being ignored. And the reality is, based on multiple different surveys, is that only a small percentage are making big money. The data is rough. It's not easy to do surveys. It's not easy to get people to be frank on the surveys. But this is fairly clear based on the combination of formal and informal surveys of the Frum community that median household income is in the vicinity of $150,000 to $200,000. That's the median, which means that half of the community is earning beneath that and half is earning above that level. 80% of households are earning less than $250,000, and only a tiny percentage are earning the seven-figure incomes that you would imagine are required for someone to easily afford the upper ends of the luxuries that we see around us. If you look at the assets that are reported on these surveys, assets, investments, it tells a similar story. About 20% report on these surveys that they have less than $10,000 in short-term savings, and only about 35% have savings and investments above $200,000. We're not including home equity. We're talking about liquid investments or even real estate investments, but not homes. So, in other words, it's fairly clear that the vast majority of our Frum community are not earning exorbitant incomes. And given the expenses of a basic Frum lifestyle, most do not have lots of money for luxuries or investments. If you look at the segments of the surveys that ask more generally, without asking specifically how much money people are earning, they ask generally, what is your financial well-being? How do you rate your financial situation? So we come up with similar answers. About 20% are doing well. 20% on the bottom say they're really struggling. And about 40% in the middle say they're doing okay. Of the 20% that are doing well, you have a sub-segment that are doing really, really well. The top few percent are making tons of money. And among the bottom percentiles that are really struggling, you have the subsection over there that are really struggling. They're not only worrying about how to make ends meet, but they're really not even able to pay their basic expenses. So, this comes back to our foundational and original assertion, which Rabbi Gortz made in our introductory episode, was that about 80% of the community can't afford based on their incomes to buy very large, expensive homes, brand new cars, fancy vacations, et cetera, et cetera. So we come back to the question: how do people earning relatively small incomes survive? So I want to talk about four different ways that people can fill up their gaps. So the first one, I won't call income. Let's quote it unquote the income of that is debt. About 65% of the community reports having debt other than their home mortgages, and about 10% report having more than $100,000 in debt. So if you have a hole in your budget, your expenses exceed your income, then a lot of people are filling that with debt. That is obviously not sustainable in the long run. And especially if they're borrowing on credit cards and paying huge interest, that is something that just mushrooms and mushrooms, and it's pouring gasoline on the fire. Another thing that's often not discussed is the effect of government social programs. Now, really, this whole episode, but specifically the government program side of it, is something that I first thought about deeply when I was reading the books of Thomas Sowell. Thomas Sowell is a very interesting personality in American journalism, political discourse, as he is an economist who's on the conservative side of the political aisle. He happens to be an African American, and this put him at odds with a lot of the more progressive, liberal colleagues of his, both in his community and also in his academic circles. And I read a number of Thomas Sowell's books, which are fantastic. He has basic economics, advanced economics, and in a very easy to read way, he cuts out the jargon, he cuts out the complex mathematics just to help illustrate how supply and demand works and how pricing works. And I consider his influence to be a very major one in my understanding of how economies work and how money works. So one of the things he discusses from the political side is that very often the conversations about income inequality, which are then used to explain why taxes and programs have to be adjusted from taking from the rich and giving to the poor, he says very often the data is not being presented accurately. And one of the very eye-opening examples of that was, he said, when the conversations about income are utilized by journalists and other activists in the space, very often they're only quoting on income before government programs, before taxes and government programs. And he says that really undermines the whole premise of how our society works. The progressive tax system that we live under basically takes huge chunks of income from upper tiers from upper income tiers and transfers that to lower income tiers. And most Americans support that conceptually on some level. Everyone will debate about what's the fair amount and who should be doing the transfers and how large the transfers would be. Is the money being utilized wisely, fairly? But Sowell illustrates that the whole foundation and the whole premise of many of these arguments are not even being presented fairly and honestly, because the numbers that really matter are the post-tax and post-transfer numbers. So this was very eye-opening to me, and I started recognizing that this was true in the political conversation nationally, but it was also true in the conversations that the Frum community has about Parnassah. And this has become a greater and greater issue and oversight, because the generosity of the government program system has increased massively over recent decades. Government programs have more than doubled the rates of transfer. The income that they are boosting has more than doubled over the past few decades. And earned income tax credit has gone up more than tenfold over the past decades. And it's very, very common for someone who has a pre-tax income of $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 for their net after transfer income to double or even triple or even more, depending on how large your family is, depending on many circumstances, whether it's healthcare, food, housing, childcare, education, utilities. Every aspect of society today is greatly affected by these government transfers. The earned income tax credit, as mentioned as well. So, this is one of the great income gap fillers where people who are have taxable incomes which is what gets reported in the census data, say that we have huge segments of the population that are earning, say, $50,000 in household income, but that is not including the massive value of government transfers that are coming in. So when that's not part of the conversation, it's just a major oversight. And as we will discuss later, it really opens up many policy questions, which have to be decided by Das Torah very often. And again, government programs is a very, very loaded topic. It leads to many, many complications in financial planning, complications in helping people get ahead. People fall into these ruts where they can't break out of government programs even if they want to. It literally requires taking massive cuts to their net income, net after government program income, which very often they can't afford. They literally can't afford, so they want to better themselves, and they can. Now, this is not an issue solely faced by the Frum community, not at all. This is a national issue, and it's very clearly known by the government. It's reported by the government. The government does their best to try to deal with some of these cliffs. There's a lot of political disagreement as well, which complicates these issues. But this is the second of the fourth income gap fillers. The other one is family help and charity. It's not unusual at all. You have one person in a family, it could be a father, it could be a brother, who's earning huge sums of money. They're in those top few percent that's earning far more money than they need for their own family. And they generously offer to help their family, whether it's with basic day-to-day, rent, mortgage, credit card payments, food, or tuition is very common, and car payments. Definitely simchis is very, very common, down payments for homes. So this is one of the things that gets missed sometimes, where someone sees, how can someone afford ABC? Well, maybe he has a brother who's helping him out substantially to afford some of those extras. Same thing with tzedakah. Tzedakah is, as we've mentioned in the other episodes, it's obviously a huge part of being a good Jew. Meiser, Chaimish, whatever people decide on those topics, but that's clearly a huge factor in transferring. That's Torah transfers from people who have more to people who have less. As Klal Yisrael gets wealthier and wealthier, and we have more and more of those people that are not just doing okay, but are doing unbelievably well. So the sums we're talking about could be gargantuan. And when it comes to tuition, for example, 50% of families report getting some kind of tuition scholarships. A large percentage are getting help for weddings, etc. There's myriad funds. There are funds today for camp. There are funds today for therapy. There are funds today, obviously, for food, other crises. This is something that needs a tremendous amount of shikol hadas, needs a tremendous amount of das Torah, but this is something that can't be ignored. It's a huge part of the answer about how people who are earning far beneath what they need to live have these fillers that enable them to get by. The final one is a little bit out of really off the beaten track, but something that's very much on my mind is what I call balabasta income. There's the famous line that a good balabasta is a halba Parnassah. Someone, a householder who's good at what she does. It's typically the she, even though today there are many men that are very good at things that traditionally were more the realm of the women folk. But the truism has a tremendous amount of accuracy in it, that if a balabasta is able to be a great shopper when it comes to food, to clothing, if she's able to do a lot of things herself when it comes to cooking, to haircuts, to tailoring, to even just tending to their children's needs. So they need less clubs. They need even less big sisters, maybe even less therapy. Who knows? If that is a part of the scenarios that just put pressures on the house when you have dual incomes, and some women are working tremendous amounts of their daily waking hours, and they are giving up that balabasta income. And I think more and more, as more and more women become professionals, and many of them are earning a lot of money as those professionals, but it's becoming a little bit of a lost art, and many people don't even recognize the tremendous economic value that having a homemaker, quote unquote, run the house as a tight ship. There's a tremendous amount of money involved in that for the people who are good at it. So that is the fourth element that I would say is a little bit head in the sand. It's something that's not discussed. These four topics: how big a factor is debt, how big a factor are government programs, how big a factor is family help and charity, and how big a factor is the balabasta income. So to illustrate this in a more down to earth and realistic fashion, I'd like to envision a scenario that could be very common. Imagine you have Kayla and Kipper. They recently joined a carpool in the new neighborhood they moved into. And over time, they started wondering about the people in their carpool, because the lifestyles that they saw around them just didn't make sense to them. They saw the spending, they did not understand the income side of it, but how was it possible? Because Kalman was an accountant, he worked really, really hard, he had to travel to his job, he was at the house every day early, he came home late, he earned $140,000 a year, and Kayla was an office manager who earned about $60,000 for a part-time job, and working they were working really, really hard. They felt like they were choking just to maintain what was middle class in their circle. And Baruch Hashem, they made ends meet, but just barely. So when they looked around them at their carpool, they did not understand how everyone else was able to make it. Okay, they got the Diamond family, Duvi and Devori Diamond. They lived in a huge, brand new home. They always had the best of everything. They went on very, very fancy vacations. They drove very, very fancy cars. They had a live-in maid, and everything was top of the line. Money was not an issue, but that was well known that Duvi's father was a well-to-do real estate guy, and Duvi ended up joining the business, growing the business, and this was pretty well known. They were big ballot stucco, very generous to everyone around them, and at the same time, they were clearly able to afford their very, very lavish lifestyle. But how did Gedalia and Goldie Gold do it? Gedalia was a busy attorney, and presumably he did really well. Goldie didn't work, and somehow they still were able to afford a very large home, luxury car leases, very, very high-end vacations. They recently made a bar mitzvah that must have cost at least $50,000. They also had a live-in housekeeper. This was something that Kayla wondered about. How much money could he be making? It's not like he owned his own firm. It's not like, their one income was one that she could imagine would be able to afford them the lifestyle that must be costing them multiples of the $200,000 that the Kippers were earning. In a way, even more puzzling was Sruli and Suri Silber. Sruli and Suri had the types of jobs that were pretty similar to what Kayla and Kalman Kipper had. Sruli was a nursing home administrator, and Suri was a title officer, and she imagined their income was probably pretty similar to the Silber's income was probably pretty similar to the Kipper's income. At the same time, their lifestyle was well above what the Kippers could afford. Everything was brand new. They drove a loaded, brand new Honda Odyssey and Pilot. They had a nice bungalow upstate that Ruchi was able to work remotely from. They had full-time cleaning help. They lived very, very Ravchis lifestyle, and Kayla Kipper wondered, how was this possible? She did not understand how the income of a nursing home administrator and title officer could afford them that kind of Ravchis. Perhaps even the greatest question mark to her was the Levy family. Leah and Libby Levy were the stereotypical Klei Kodesh. Leah was a stay-at-home mom for their large family. Libby was a well-known and respected Rebbe. At the same time, they did not have an upgraded fancy lifestyle, but everything seemed very, very stable and relaxed. Their house was a nice house. The landscaping was always tip top. The kids always had nice yontifs, nice outfits for yontif. They went to camp. They always went on a solid business mountain trip. Nothing crazy, nothing super high end, but still, this was something that Kayla wondered about. They had one Rebbe income. They clearly were earning a far less than the Kipper's two incomes. And how could the $50, $60, $70,000 that Rabbi Levi was bringing in as a Rebbe not leave them in a state of terrible, terrible financial distress? So this is a made up scenario, but one that could be very realistic, where the spending of these five families is obvious. Everyone can look at each other, and it's not polite to be asking, how can you afford your lifestyle? And it's not necessarily healthy. Everyone should be minding their own business, but it's human nature for people to wonder, especially people who are struggling so hard to keep up what they consider the basics, and people somehow are able to afford that much more. Now, based on these four factors that we discussed, we can explain to the Kippers that if they knew the other incomes that were coming in to these families, then it's not surprising at all. What you didn't know about the Gold family was that they were terribly in debt. Their gorgeous brand new home was mortgaged to the hilt. The luxury cars they were driving were leased, and they had hundreds of thousands of dollars in credit card debt, which they were using to fill the gap between their extremely lavish lifestyle and the income that Gedalia Gold brought in. So the Silber family was unique in one simple fact that Kayla didn't know, was that Suri Silber was Dovi Diamond's sister. So the Silbers worked really hard at their to bring in their income, but at the same time, the Diamonds generously gave them the Raufchis money, the extras. Dovi didn't want his siblings to be struggling to the bone, and he could easily afford to gift his family money for the extras. So that extra $150,000 was nothing to Dovi, but it meant the world to the Silbers. They were able to live a Ravchis, comfortable lifestyle, and they weren't choking because they had family support. The Klei Kodesh question, how could a family living on one Rebbe salary not be in dire poverty, is ignoring the other factors. First of all, government programs. Because the income was so low, they were fully legally entitled to significant government assistance. Their healthcare was covered, their food was covered, their housing was largely covered, their utilities were largely covered. And this net value was significant to help them cover their basics. Tuition was something that Rabbi Levi negotiated with his school. His boys, he did not pay any tuition for. And even his girls, he had an arrangement, a tuition reduction arrangement, where even his girls' tuitions were largely not a financial burden to him. And finally, Mrs. Leah Levy was a true balabasta. She was able to stretch $1. She was an amazing shopper. She bought things in bulk when they were on sale. Clothing was bought when it was on sale. When there was a simcha, she did everything herself in advance, whether it was a shalom zacher, a bris, upsharin, siyumim. She did everything herself. She did it gorgeously, but but in a way that nobody would have known that these things cost her very, very little, because she was an amazing balabasta. She gave her kids haircuts on herself. She washed her own sheitel, and on and on and on and on. So they were able to live a very, very bakavadiga lifestyle, despite the fact that they had one tiny income. But when you add in the government programs, you add in the tzedakah assistance that they got before Yantif, before Simchas, et cetera, and the fact that Mrs. Levy was an amazing balabasta, they were able to live, not a Rafchas lifestyle, but a very, very comfortable lifestyle that was not b'tzimtzum and not b'lachatz. So here we have it. These are illustrations of how you can have five families, their incomes are unknown, their spending is public, but when you peel back the layers of the onion, this is how people are doing it. So this brings us to some real serious questions. And these are things that we would like to explore down the line. First of all, most importantly, is how can we help people increase their incomes? That question, of course, is very important. But even if we get people to what are considered very high incomes, they still very often will not have enough. So they may be turning to debt. So we have to be thinking about that. What can we do to help people avoid debt, get out of debt? Credit card debt, for sure, is very pernicious. And it's very easy. People are getting enticed when they're younger. They think it's a temporary thing. Maybe they join to get some miles, and then they had a tough month. Next thing they know, they're $10,000 in credit card debt, $30,000, $50,000, $100,000, and it's a huge problem. So then they want to get out of debt. So they're looking around. If there was a gemach that could help them get out of debt, they would be able to avoid the interest of 15, 20 to 25% even. That makes it almost impossible to dig out. Or definitely, it's far easier to dig out if you can borrow interest free. So that's something that can be a real game changer if coupled with budget guidance and coaching. If people were able to access gemach loans to avoid debt that becomes overwhelming. The complexities of government programs and tzedakah that we mentioned before are very, very challenging issues that need to be dealt with deftly and sensitively, but also in a logical way, in a transparent, savvy way. I sat through a training program for budget advisory, which I mentioned in the prior podcast, and it immediately struck me. They were saying that we want to help. One of the ways we want to help people is help them increase their income. If they could just bring in that last $10,000, $20,000, then they'll have enough. So I asked them, I said, are you aware that many of the people you're going to be speaking to that are struggling, the way the government programs are structured is that you can raise them $10,000 and they can lose $10,000 in government programs, even $20,000 in government programs. If they just fall off free health insurance for the parents, that itself could be thousands of dollars that raise can lose them. So are you helping them or hurting them? Now, if you can get them far beyond that first initial cliff that they fall off, then obviously in the long run, that could be very, very useful and vital. But we still have to be realistic about what that means. Maybe this couple just can't earn large sums of money. And by pushing them over the guidelines where they're not eligible for programs, but they can't earn a lot of money, you could be hurting them. Now, again, this is a political issue. This is a PR issue for the community. These are very, very serious issues. And, but to me, it's the elephant in the room at this point where you're talking about massive, massive sums of money. And, if we're going to be counseling people to shoot themselves in the foot, that's obviously a bad idea. We need to have realistic plans to help people bridge past government programs in a way that in the long run brings them to stability. It also distorts who is in more distress and who should be priorities for assistance, and whether it's tuition discounts, etc. When it comes to government programs and tzedakah, a Rebbe with a $60,000 salary and $30,000 in tuition discounts is very often in a very, very different financial place than an accountant with a $90,000 W-2 salary, or a business owner who's struggling with his business. I once met a business owner who was in horrible financial shape, was earning very, very little net from his business. But the way the government program eligibilities were structured, he was not entitled to any government programs. So he was bringing in, his income was horrible. His income was well under $100,000, but he wasn't getting any government assistance. So these are very complex topics. A lot of das Torah is needed here. A lot of chachma is needed. A lot of just technical savvy is needed. How do you combine the knowledge? Obviously compliance is super important. Dina de Machusa Dina, and it's very important that we don't make a chil Hashem and we don't abuse the Medina Shel Chesed that we live in. So these are very, very difficult topics that require technical savvy. It requires das Torah. On the tzedakah side, I bumped into Rabbi Eli Fried Shlita, one of Lakewood's great Talmidei Chachamim, and he mentioned to me that he was at a knessia where Moshe Feinstein Zatzal said that Klal Yisrael brings him shilas in every which topic, every which mitzvah of the Shulchan Aruch. They bring shilas to the Galadar. He said there's two topics that people seem to feel are not worthy of getting his psak on, and that was chinuch habanim and tzedakah. And these tzedakah questions, especially now, where we're talking about massive sums of money that are being shifted here, there, it's something that we really have to be accurate and honest and sensitive and compassionate to people who may be in dire straits and not be recognized. There may be limited cases of people who are not in dire straits, but they fit the boxes, and maybe they shouldn't be getting tzedakah. Again, it's way over my pay grade, but it's something that we need to be realistic about if we want to help Klal Yisrael in the best way. The balabasta income is a topic that we're going to revisit in depth. I often say that, if my Elta Zayda, Tchias HaMesim, he came to Lakewood and he observed how I live my day, how my siblings live my day, and how my friends live their day, he would say it largely mirrors the day that he lived back in Arshava or the other villages that my ancestors came from. Jewish men, they get up, they daven, they learn, if they're not in yeshiva, then they're making parnassah, they're going back home to help their families, they're going back to shul. Yeah, so of course we have the modern conveniences. We have electricity. We have internet. We have computers. We have cars. We have antibiotics. But the general schedule, the general role or responsibilities is actually very similar. The same would not be said if my Elta Baba came here and looked at how my wife lives, how my sisters live, and how their friends and family on the other side of the mechitza live their lives. Things have become so different. Where for thousands of years, a woman's role as a keres habayis, as a homemaker, as a mother, was very, very clear cut. Today, you have women that do very, very little of that, and it's extremely, they're torn in so many different directions. They still are the wives and the mothers and the sheichayil. Many of them are sole breadwinners, as the Klei Kodesh and Koil has expanded, which is a beautiful thing. But it really opens up so many new questions, both communally and individually, about how does that affect them as people? How does that affect them as mothers? How does that affect them as wives? And this is a Parnassah podcast. From an income perspective, I think that very often the calculations, by the time a woman's, once she has a house full of kids and she can't put in, full time, and at the same time her income is being taxed, and it's just impossible. You can't then expect her also to be great at shopping and great at cooking, and great at supporting their husband and spouses. It's just the ramifications on a purely financial perspective, I think, are underappreciated, undervalued. It's very relevant for the career counseling and coaching and training that women are undergoing. If they're taking careers that after 2-3 years are just not realistic for Frum women, or if they do want to stick to those careers, it means that the household expenses are going to be far more than they would be otherwise. It's something that should be accounted for. And it's a great avenue for conversation. So I'm not trying to push women back into the kitchens if they don't want to be there, but I'm speaking purely from a financial perspective that we need to recognize that there's a cost to the new model, the new dual income model. This is something that financial planners, economists, even frankly the feminists in the country are commenting, that in many ways this has changed so many different things. And from an economic perspective, the dual income structure very often is far less financially advantageous than many assume. So, that's really the income side of the questions. One of the key takeaways, I would say, that's on a very practical level, is since everyone's income is private and it varies so greatly, people earning tremendous sums of money, people earning moderate sums of money, people earning low sums, but then you have all the additions. Are they getting family support? Are they getting significant tuition reductions based on their jobs? Are they eligible for government programs? Do they just simply they have a very tremendous ability to keep their expenses far lower? You can't just look at everyone else and assume what they're doing is going to work for you. You have to make it work for you, and you got to run your own numbers. You can't just buy a large, massive home because all your friends are. You can't just go on very expensive vacations and shop in certain stores because all your friends are. Because your friends are very likely in their very different circumstance than your situation. So I would say that's the main thing. Very often you could have someone broke leading others who are going to be broke. If the circle that you're following, for all you know, they're all heavily in debt, and they're really racing towards they're all racing towards a cliff, and that's not the herd to follow. So you have to make your own cheshbonos. Most people need to live modestly with a cheshbon in order if they want to pay their bills, avoid debt, avoid stuck, or have a shot at building some real wealth. They need to live modestly. They need to live with a cheshbon. So that's something every family has to work on their own. I do want to comment. This is like, you could tune out for the next 2-3 minutes if you struggle with mathematics. But, there's the famous, pithy comment that, you could have a bunch of people in the room and the average income in the room is $100,000. And then Bill Gates walks into the room and all of a sudden the average income in the room is 99 million. Obviously you still have the same for everyone in the room, nothing changed, even though the average number has accurately would be calculated to have gone up drastically. So this is just one of the number tricks that an outlier, somebody who's just so off the charts, can have a massive effect. So, but in a very realistic sense, imagine you have a community of 15,000 families, and the bottom half of them, 50% of them, have a median income of $100,000, which is fairly. It's not a bad bet for some Frum communities. Now imagine at the same time, so that's 7,500 families. They average $100,000. So that means collectively, those 7,500 families are bringing in $750 million in annual income. If it's 0.5% of the 15,000 families, so if 0.5%, 75 families are earning $10 million a year, so $10 million a year times 75 families is the same $750 million in income. So it's not unusual. This really could be the case. It's possible that this is the reality in the Frum world, that you can have the bottom 50% collectively, 7,500 families collectively have as much spending power as 75 families. Now, think what that does from an outlier effect on spending, right? So imagine someone's opening up a jewelry store. And he has a choice. He could focus on designing his offerings for the 7,500 families who are bringing in $100,000 in income. How much jewelry could they afford on an annual basis? Not very much. Or he could design his store to cater to the 75 families that are bringing in an average of $10 million a year. Yeah, he can make a parnassah, a beautiful parnassah, just from selling jewelry to those 75 families. Same for a high-end restaurant, same for high-end boutiques, same for luxury clothes, for luxury cars, same for builders, et cetera, et cetera. You have to remember, even though these two groups, the 75 families and the 7,500 families, they're both earning $750 million, but the 75 families that are averaging $10 million, most of that money is quote unquote discretionary income. They have a ton of money for tzedakah, so they could be giving, like we discussed with David Diamond. He can easily afford to give his 5-10 siblings $100,000 a year of Ravchus money. All of a sudden, you have hundreds of families that would have been middle income, but now they have that Ravchus money. That makes a huge effect. They're also giving huge amounts of tzedakah. How they direct their tzedakah funds makes a huge impact, and you shouldn't be surprised when the tzedakah campaigns are largely going to be targeting those 75 families, because who has the money to give? Who has the huge discretionary income to give vast amounts of tzedakah? And it's far easier to get one huge donation from someone earning $10 million if you can get it. If you can get a very large donation, your net value is far more than trying to pursue that amount from 7,500 families, or the families earning 100,000, right? If you spend a lot of time with each one, how much are you going to get? Whereas if you spend a lot of time with those 75 families, they could afford to give you a large amount of tzedakah. So this is a very, very common outlier effect where you can have a community of 15,000 families, but 75 of those 15,000, 0.5% of those 15,000 can really be driving a tremendous ripple effect throughout the whole community. And then if people start trying to copy them, because look, they could afford it, and they're giving tons of tzedakah. Now, I want to point out, many of those Gvirim live very modestly, and the only upgrades they're doing is giving a ton of tzedakah, helping out a ton of people in their families, and then investing further so they can give even more tzedakah. So I'm not trying to say that all the high end spending is being done by the wealthiest. Very often, it's the other tiers, people living on debt or spending every single thing that they have. But bottom line, this outlier effect can create a lot of surprise in when the magazines are focused on luxury spending. It could give off vibes that the entire community is really has that kind of disposable income, but really very often they're really only targeting the top few percent that have a lot of money. So you shouldn't get fooled by it. You shouldn't get fooled by the people around you that maybe are living on debt, or maybe they have wealthy family helping them out, or whatever other way they're able to afford luxury. You got to remember also, one man's luxury is another man's necessity. For some people, having a ton of cleaning help and and being able to buy takeout is their sanity. Maybe camp for them is an absolute must. Maybe having a super reliable car they decided is non-negotiable. A large home for some people is not a luxury. They consider that a necessity. They're ready to scrimp and save in other categories. But these outlier effects, I think, are very, very magnified in the Frum community, and it helps explain a lot of the confusion. We have a lot of, I believe we're overrepresented in the entrepreneurial class, which tends to be boom or bust. So you have a lot of entrepreneurs that are hitting massive grand slams, making massive sums of money. You have a lot of entrepreneurs that are going bankrupt and are heavily in debt. At the same time, we have a ton of Klei Kodesh, ton of Kailul that have very, very low standard incomes, and very often they need support and other things from the people with money. And there's a lot of shifting over there, a lot of transferring over there, and this makes things very, very confusing. If you're just going to go with the flow and look at people around you and say, I'm going to spend like the people around me, then very often you're not really getting a good sense of what's going to work for you. So that is that's the episode. That income is private, spending is public. You cannot look at other people's spending and assume how much money they have. They may be heavily in debt. They may be getting heavy support of tzedakah, family. Maybe government programs is doing its job. Maybe the woman is just an amazing balabasta and she's able to stretch $1 into 10, which there are those amazing people out there. And we have to, as a community, we have to be answering a lot of the realities that go with that. But every individual family has to make it work for them. Be'ez Hashem, the upcoming episodes, we hope to start shifting into the potential solutions that individuals can implement for themselves, and that people can perhaps get involved. Abbas Chesed, let's try to help each other. Let's try to help the community. We're going to get into the game changers that I mentioned. We also want to explore askanos. In order for game changers to happen, in order all those organizations, it's stuck organizations, the yeshivas that are really, that's where a lot of the shifting happens, where people who could afford to subsidize other people's tuitions are doing so, and that's part of the Kehillah model. That's a manifestation of the Kehillah model that started in the Gemara's times and has shifted over the years, but is really largely, it's a huge component of our lives. You need askanim, you need people to jump in, to be willing to undertake these communal projects, and that's something that's we daven for them every week, but at the same time, it creates a lot of challenge and controversy. Are they doing it right? What is the right way? How should Das Torah be interacting? Both top down, bottom up. The type of shilas that have to be asked, as we mentioned for Billy Levine, who quoted Moshe Feinstein, that the tzedakah shilas have to be asked. We also want to start implementing, and this is an open call, as part of my Ahavas Chesed, and encouraging everyone else to have Ahavas Chesed, we'd like to offer Parnassah focused organizations free elevated pitches. We want to have them on the podcast. They can speak 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. I'll interview them, ask them what they do, who do they help, how they help them, how can people get involved, whether it's donating money to them, whether it's volunteering for them, whether it's doing PR for them, sending them people, connecting them with the people who need assistance in the Parnassah realm. That is a feature we'd like to bring onto each episode. We'd like to have these elevator pitches. So if you want to pitch, or you know someone that should be pitched, please let me know. You should visit geldguide.com. We have over 200 articles that can help you invest better, save more money, earn more money, lower your tax bills, et cetera, et cetera. You can also send me an email. I try to answer every single email myself. So you can email me through geldguide.com. You should subscribe to our newsletter, which you can do through the website, geldguide.com. We have the newsletter, which goes every week. If you do want to get the best and most updated news about the podcast, the newsletter is going to be the place to do it. We're gonna have links there. We're gonna have show notes there, links to transcripts, et cetera, et cetera. So go to geldguide.com, subscribe to the newsletter, and thank you for listening. Please spread the word that this is the new place if you want to explore Parnassah topics in a data-driven way. Then this is the place to do it. And if you have feedback, I hope I didn't ruffle feathers here. It's not my intent. I do ask a lot of shilas, and if you take issue with anything I've said here, please don't hesitate. Please do it in a respectful manner, a logical manner. But I'm wide open. If you take issue with anything I've said, let me know. And if I think it's a shiloh, I will definitely ask, and we'll see what they say. Thank you for joining me on this episode of the Parnassah Podcast. If you like this episode, please share it with your family and friends. Visit geldguide.com to send me your questions, comments, or feedback. Be'ez Hashem, I respond to each email personally. Geldguide.com is also where you can read hundreds of exclusive Parnassah articles and subscribe to my free weekly newsletter with new Parnassah insights and updates. Please remember that building wealth is not about how much you earn, but how much you save and invest. And finally, in the beautiful words of Micha, Perek Vav, Higel lecha adam ma toiv u'ma shem darash mincha ki yem aseis mishpat, v'yahavas chesed v'atznei alecha sim alikecha.